Welcome to this distinguished visitor lecture today. We have Rochette who is here, and she's going to be talking to us about legal education in Canada. And in particular, she's going to be sharing with us some of what came out of the study that she did of law schools across Canada, particularly as it pertains to our law school. And so an opportunity for us to reflect on what we're doing here, reflect on how what we're doing here fits into the bigger scheme of things, and for me, anyways, reflect on the ways in which we can be leaders in legal education. I have the privilege of introducing Annie, and I just told her that notwithstanding that I printed off her voluminous CV, and she has many, all kinds of research accomplishments and many recognition and accolades for her teaching, for her research, and for her contributions to legal education in Canada. That's not what I'm going to talk about. What I wanted to say was, as someone who came into the legal academy, into life in a law school, with a tremendous interest and motivated fundamentally by my interest in teaching and my interest in my students and what they bring to the future, I attended, and we were just trying to figure out the date, and she's scratching her head at me. I think it was probably 2002, the annual meeting of the Canadian Association of Law Teachers that was held at the University of Toronto. And Annie had been a speaker. Yeah, there we go. She was our lunchtime speaker. And she was, I don't know if you'd even begun your master's program then, or maybe you'd had done your master's. Hadn't started the doctoral work that is the foundation of what you're going to hear about today. And she inspired me so much in her energy, her enthusiasm, her commitment to legal education and to learning and to what it should and could be about and the potential that we could all live up to. And so for me, early in my career, I had just started at U of M, to hear someone that inspiring speaking was really an amazing gift. And she's, of course, gone on to do so much with that. So she's been the president of the Canadian Association of Law Teachers. She's participated in the discussions that have occurred nationally around regulating or accrediting Canadian law schools. She's the founding editor of CLEAR, REDAC, the Canadian Legal Education Annual Review, and is currently acting as the editor-in-chief as we speak, as it is publishing its sixth, I think. We're on to volume 6. So clearly someone who's committed to teaching. So without further ado, and without listing all of the accomplishments on that CV, I'm going to hand you over to Annie, who will tell you about us.
I always feel funny when people introduce me because I feel like it's not me. But thank you, Lorna, for that wonderful introduction. And I do totally remember that conference now. Anyway, so this is my doctoral work. So I went on a big empirical exploration of law teaching in Canada. And so I'm going to talk about the results of that today. So these were my research questions for my project. So basically, what are the educational or learning objectives that law professors have? What teaching and evaluations do they use, and in what kinds of variables influence their choices? Why do they choose those teaching and evaluation methods? So trying to identify the factors that influence pedagogical choices in law professors. And what lessons can we learn from this? So basically the so what part, which I added this at the end of it because I had a lot of arguments with my supervisor, but basically I added this last piece at the very end of it, so the so what part. So I won't talk a lot about the so what part today because I probably don't have time, but you can ask me about it if you want. Okay, my methodology. This is an empirical exploration, so here's my methodology, so my little map. Basically, I did an online questionnaire on teaching evaluation methods. So I invited 797 full-time law professors in Canada to participate. For most of, and this is the academic year 2005, 2006. Many of them I had to invite more than once to participate. And I got 273 respondents, which is really good. It's a 34 participation rate. For an online questionnaire, this is excellent. So a big thank you to all the people who participated in this. I also did 2 different questionnaires. One was in French, one was in English, because, as it turned out, that was a colossal mistake when it came down to actually analyzing the results, because I had to do it manually. I had to add all of the results manually, the French and English. However, I didn't want the survey to be cluttered with text, so that's why I did the 2 languages. So and then I did field work. So I actually went and did 9 visits to 9 different law faculties in Canada. And then I stayed about 2 to 3 weeks in each. And I have to thank the BC Law Foundation for helping to fund this, my travels abroad, my travels that were expensive. And then I did 50 in-class observations and 50 semi-structured qualitative interviews with law professors. Now, there's a big chunk of this research that is excluded, of teaching that's excluded, and that's adjuncts. A lot of the courses are taught by adjuncts, but I thought they're harder to get a hold of, and I don't think they reflect as much about teaching as professors do, but it could be different. But anyway, so that's to keep in mind, that these results don't reflect adjunct teaching, which is a big chunk of teaching. Maybe in a further study, if I have time and energy, I will go on to do that. And then for the data analysis of all the interviews and the observations, I use a method called grounded theory. And basically what it is you start with no preconceived notions, apparently. So I didn't actually look at any of the literature on learning before I did this. I looked at it after. So trying to find patterns, and I use a software called Atlas TI. Some of you might be familiar with NVivo in qualitative research. Atlas TI is a different one, but it was recommended to me by the professor on my committee who does qualitative research, and I really enjoyed it. Anyways, so that's basically just the methodology. Really, really quickly, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. These are the law schools that I visited. There's no names here because for confidentiality reasons. Although everybody's been told that I was here. I was here. There's the Prairies one. So I did 6 in-class observations and 6 interviews here at U of M. And then I did 2 in the West, 3 in Ontario, 3 in Quebec. The Maritimes are not represented here, and it's not because I don't like the Maritimes. I love the Maritimes, but I ran out of time and resources. So I had to make choices in the end, and I wasn't able to go. So a big study. This is doing the analysis for this kind of data was really, really long. It took me 7 years. Okay, so if we go back to the survey, I'm just going to quickly talk about the survey result because that's not the most interesting part of the study, and it basically will tell you exactly what you already know. But just so you know, the people who answered the survey, this is what their rank was. So most of them, as you can see, were full professors, 41%. Assistant professor were a big chunk too. So and there's a huge gap in the teaching body, the faculty bodies, because in the 90s there was a big freeze on hiring. So that's why you see there's only, the years of experience. I think there we go. So less than 3. Between 10 and 11, 20 years. Between 7 and 10 is only 10%. That's because of the hiring freeze. Because I did this in 2005. So most people, you see 30% more than 20 years. So you can see that my survey population is heavy on the older people and heavy on the assistant, new non-tenured professors. The gender breakdown of the survey population was roughly 50-50, which I was like, wow, that's amazing. It doesn't totally represent the population out there of law professors, but close. It's not that far off. The regional representation of the survey population was also resembling what it actually is in real life. So that's so basically my sample is quite representative. Okay, so what did I find? Did I find a treasure? The results of the survey are what I say. I always say they're quite boring, in the fact that they kind of just confirm what we already sort of knew about law teaching, which is mostly lecture, mostly final exam evaluation methods, right? However, both the survey results and my observations especially Now, you have to keep in mind that the people who chose to participate in the observations, who's agreed to be, probably think of themselves as really good teachers, because otherwise they would not have agreed for me to observe. So keep that in mind, right? That's sort of, but both the survey and my observations kind of confirm that yes, it is predominantly the lecture, but it is supplemented, complemented by other more interactive methods, such as discussion, Q&A, and a little bit Socratic, but mostly question and discussion. And so if you look at here, this is hard to see, but the light blue bar is the lecture. And this is over the course of a semester. So I asked professors how often, how many over the course of a semester, they use these different types of methods. And you see lecture, you can see it clearly, right? In every class, very often, or regularly. You see class discussion is the light green also, but you see it's rarely, but it's mostly occasionally. Role playing, never. The black one is pop quizzes, never. So there's a few methods that were not really used. But you can see class discussion, the light green, where question answer is the brown. So you see it's there. You see the three colors that are more predominant are discussion, question and answer, and lecture, which is kind of not surprising. That's sort of what we knew. Small groups or pairs, hardly ever used. You see that's the red, which is somehow disappointing. And then in one typical class, so I asked them over the course of a semester, and then I asked them for one typical class. And you can see for lecture, it's not the whole class, but that's what I said, right? Supplemented with class discussion. So you see the light blue bar again, very predominant. So, and then discussion is used 10 to 25% of a class time. Quite a bit. Did these make sense, these graphs? Yeah, okay. Teaching methods vary according to the course type. And what I mean by course type is it a mandatory course? Is it a upper year seminar? Is it a mandatory course first year, upper year? I slotted them all together for this graph versus the seminar type. So we have lecture mandatory. In a mandatory class, you see the green and yellow, so it's used between 50% and 75% of the time. And for a seminar, you see that discussion, the yellow, if you look at the yellow and green bars. So in the seminar, obviously discussion is more predominant. Again, that makes sense, right? Whereas in the mandatory course, lecture is more predominant. Can you see the difference? Yes? Okay. Boring. Okay. I want to get to the factors, so I'm going to... Evaluation methods. Big surprise. Final sit-down examinations used by 71% of respondents, survey respondents. Assignments are quite frequent, though. And you see this does not total 100%, obviously, because people could answer, they could obviously use more they don't obviously use more than one evaluation method, but often they do. In Quebec, most universities have university rules that say you cannot have one evaluation method worth more than 50 or 60%. My institution, we have to have more than one evaluation method. So that obviously has an impact on the results. Midterm sit-down, very predominant as well. So if you look at it, you would, this way you think, okay, so the predominant method is the final sit-down exam, usually with one assignment or one midterm exam. The weight of the final, only 17% of respondents use 100% final exam. So not that, it's surprising. What? 17%. I actually thought it was going to be more than that. My own experience as a law student at McGill was all 100% final exams. So I was surprised to see it's only 17% that use that. But I would say the majority of respondents use a final exam that's worth 50% or more of the grade when they do use it. Okay, so now that I've sort of told you what you already knew, but it's now empirically confirmed, let's look at why law teachers use the teaching and evaluation methods that they use. Okay, so what influenced teaching practices? And the first factor that came up is conceptions of teaching. And this didn't come up at first when I looked at the data. When I looked at the data, I had two big families of factors. One was what I called the internal factors, and the other one were the external factors. And internal factors I grouped together in like teaching philosophy, what their own experience was, and all of this. Then I went and I looked at the literature, and I discovered the literature on conceptions of teaching. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. So I put it all aside, tried to ignore that I had read it, went back to the data, because this is what you're supposed to do when you do grounded theory, went back to the data and used what I called pools of meaning, I'm going to explain this in a bit, to figure out what different conceptions of teaching law professors had. What I mean by pools of meaning is that I didn't plunk individual people into categories. I plugged the quotations. So the difference is, and I'm going to come back to that because the difference is quite important. So one person could have expressed ideas that would put them in a few different conceptions of teaching, and I'm going to come back to that, okay? But that's important to remember that I looked at the quotations and I didn't look at individual people. So here are the different conceptions of teaching that came up. Can you read that? We start from transmitting all the way to transforming. And we have what I call the teaching-centered conceptions all the way to the learning-centered conception. The boundaries between each of these at the bottom are soft, meaning that one person can express ideas that would put them into one or more of these, right? However, the boundary between teaching-centered and learning-centered is a hard one, meaning people who express ideas related to a teaching-centered conception of teaching did not express ideas related to a learning-centered. So, and the other thing too is there's an arrow because it goes one way. So some people who expressed ideas with learning-centered, that would put them in a learning-centered conception, also expressed ideas for transmitting, but not vice versa. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Okay. So here are the different ones. Transmitting conception. I like doing flowcharts and diagrams. I should have been a sociologist. Teacher, content, student. So basically, I'm transmitting the course content. What I mean by content is knowledge, skills, and attitudes, right? So I'm transmitting. And here are some quotations that kind of express these ideas. So you have to let them know what the rules are. And I guess that's where I come at it from, is that I always start with, my job is to teach these students the law. Heard that quite a bit in the interviews. And then the French one, ça va avoir des conséquences. J'essaie de ne pas prendre de retard parce que je ne peux pas me permettre qu'ils n'aient pas vu certaines notions. Donc this idea that they have to, this is the obsession with coverage, and I'm going to come back to in a moment. The second conception of teaching is what I call the modeling conception. And then all of the different conceptions of teaching that I found within law professors, this would be the typical law one. So meaning in the literature on conceptions of teaching, this modeling thing did not come up. It's very typical to law. And if you think about what the Carnegie report has sort of said, the signature pedagogy of law school, which is the case method, this makes a lot of sense. So basically the teacher is the content, or becomes or performs the content, right? So this is why the case method, right? Look at me, watch me, I am doing legal reasoning in front of you, right? And you just have to watch me. And this is interesting. Read the second quote. I love the second quote. It's mysterious how it happens. You know, it's osmosis-like. Nobody really understands how it happens, but generations of law students testify to the fact that this happens. In February of first year, everybody goes, oh, that's what this exercise is about. So, and I heard this a lot in the interviews, like at some point, the students just get it, usually in February of first year. And you probably think that's, oh yeah, I've noticed that, right? The little light goes off at some point. However, the people that have this conception, or the ideas that were expressed, did not know how this happened. It just happened, and they're quite happy about it. But and the Carnegie report talks about this osmosis idea too, that learning by osmosis. However, the Carnegie report also says this is learning by apprenticeship, basically, right? You have an expert thinker in front of you, and you learn by watching them do something. But the Carnegie report says if you want learning with apprenticeship, you need students to adopt a deep learning approach and not a surface learning approach, which I'm going to come back to later. And also, there has to be time for them to reflect on what they're watching. Otherwise, the learning is quite small or happens totally out of your control. Okay, motivating conception. So teacher-student content. The teacher motivates the student to learn the content on their own. And this one is either teaching-centered or learning-centered because there were different... The ones that talk to me about internal motivation of the students and trying to bring their enthusiasm to rub off on the students, they're a bit more learning-centered. However, the one that talked about entertaining, because a few professors talked to me about entertaining students. You know, they pay a lot of money. I think, do I have quotes? I hope that my role is to get them excited about what they're learning and what they'll just keep reading and asking questions. And I wish I could say that, all of them do that, but they don't do all that, but that's what I hope for, right? So you see that they want to sort of get students to be enthusiastic about the subject so that they'll want to learn more, right? On the other hand, the entertaining idea, people are spending a lot of time on this and they're spending increasing amounts of money, and it should be an entertaining thing for them to go to. This is a class. I believe it's a tax law class, but it's not Michelle. They shouldn't feel like it's dead time. And they don't have to be here, right? They could pay their money and get notes, la, la, la. And so basically, something out of it, they should go relatively quickly. So this idea of entertaining students. So that's why I'm putting it more teaching-centered, because it's focused on me, the entertainer. And there's this whole idea related to that that's teaching us performance, which I feel like I'm doing right now, which I don't like. But next one on the thing, acquisition. I'm going a bit fast, sorry. But getting or helping students. So getting students to or helping students to. So one, getting students to is going to be a bit more teaching-centered, and the helping students to is going to be more learning-centered. Getting students to, I have a few quotes. These are entertaining, aren't they? The quotes. My teaching approach, I think, is one that is very student-centered, one that focuses on what do we have to get through today, and where am I going to lose you? If I'm going to lose students somewhere along the way, I probably will. I think my approach is one that gives students as many opportunities as possible to show what they know and to give them as many opportunities to ask questions. But it is that I will take you through this. I will get you to understand this. Whereas the other one is my role is to help students understand what the law is. And this one I like. This is a professor that compares herself to a belayer when you're climbing. So she sees herself as helping the students and being there, as a sort of a casting net, but to facilitate their learning. I like that. That's a good one. There's a lot of good quotes. Okay, now we're getting into the learning on the continuum. We're getting into the really learning-centered conceptions of teaching, where the teacher basically creates a learning environment. You see the students sort of half there, but half outside too, where the students will learn the content. So your role is to facilitate student learning. So create opportunities for them to learn. It is not to get them to understand things. Different. So some ideas that come up under that, right? Ideas that were expressed with from the people, are student responsibility. Students are responsible for their own learning. I'm just there to help them through. Can you read that, or is that too small? Sorry. Fundamentally, I think students are responsible for their own learning, and I see my role as a facilitator of their learning rather than someone who has some great knowledge that I have to sort of take out of my head and put into their head. I'm not shy about admitting when I don't know something. If someone asks me a question, I'll say, I don't know, or throw it back to them, where we can find the answer to that. There was a whole idea of creating a safe learning environment. So, and especially, this was mentioned, especially concerned with marginalized students. And so they wanted to make sure that there was an environment where people felt safe to ask questions, people felt safe to interact. And here's a quote. I think that the approach I would take is probably the same in all of them, which is infused with the idea that students do best when they feel like they are in a safe learning space. So if they feel like they're in a place that's familiar and you can try and make them feel disarmed at the beginning, they'll do better. If they're feeling that they're not being imposed upon but welcome and invited, then I think that they do better. So an idea of this, safe learning space. Also, part of this idea was acknowledging students' previous experiences. Now, if you know about constructivist learning theory, you know that students learn when they integrate the new knowledge with the previous knowledge that they already have. Nobody that I interviewed knew or seemed to know explicitly about this constructivist idea of learning, but it was sort of implicit, I think intuitive, sort of. Okay. And then the last one, which was not expressed very often in ideas that in interviews, is transforming. Basically is seeing learning as a conceptual change in students, in learners, and facilitating that. So it's going a step further than the facilitating learning. It's really about conceptual changes in the students, and that they see their role as facilitating that change. This you have to know about, constructivist learning theories. But there were a few people who expressed ideas that would put them in this conception of. I would say this was not very. It wasn't expressed that often. Okay, so after I did all this, and I thought it was fascinating. I thought it was fascinating. Maybe you didn't, but then I thought, well, is there a link between people's conceptions of teaching and what they actually do in the classroom? And the literature does not make an explicit link between the two. They talk, and then the literature is confused about teaching approaches, teaching strategies, and all. I'm not going to get into that. But basically, the link between conceptions of teaching and teaching practices is not really made in the literature. What the literature does is make links between conceptions of teaching and student learning approaches. It jumps over the teaching part, which I thought was interesting. So I went back to the data, and this is when I put people in different categories. However, I divided them into remember the teaching centered and the learning centered? So I used those two broad groups. I didn't use the subcategories because, like I said, many people expressed ideas that would put them in more than one category, so that was not doable. Does that make sense? And here are the different groupings that emerged from the data. This is what's fun about qualitative research. I had no idea I was going to find this. So there's 4 different groups. There's those people at the top who have teaching-centered conceptions of teaching, right? And use teacher-focused practices. Teacher-focused means focused on me. So even though you use Q&A or discussion, it's interactive, but it's focused on you, right? That's the first grouping. At the very bottom here, we have those with the learning-centered conceptions of teaching, who use mostly, but not exclusively, learning-focused practices. Use small groups, role plays, debates, all this stuff. They will use lecture, but they have a learning rationale behind using the lecture. So that's my 4th grouping. Now, in the middle, this is my intuitive group. This is people who express ideas that would put them in both learning-centered and teaching-centered, and that used a variety of teaching practices. And I call them my intuitive group because they don't really know why they're doing things, but they seem to think that that's a good idea to mix it up. And they express ideas really that would put them in teaching-centered and learning-centered. But they're quite happy with themselves, those people. And I'm saying this because the next group is my disconnected group. And these people are not happy. They're cynical, they're bitter, they're frustrated, they're tired, they're exhausted. And those people are the people with learning-centered conceptions who use teacher-focused practices. And why is this group? This group is about 1/3 of the participants. So it's a big group. I didn't want to put numbers on it, and my supervisor kept hassling me to put numbers, so I finally did. And I said, I'm going to put proportions, because in qualitative research, you're not supposed to put numbers. Anyways. So, why is this group important? It's important because this group points to all the other factors that influence their choices, because they're not happy. And the other thing, too, is we have to pay attention to them because they're burnt out. you know, and they were all ages, like not, or all levels. So, some of the factors that this group talked about in their frustration. The first one is what I call an overwhelming concern with coverage. And you see, there's a quote there. So there's a real tension between teaching so that I'm sure they understand, i.e. I should use learning focused practicing, and teaching so that I cover all the rights. This was a charter course. So there's, upset. And this came up a lot in the interviews, that have to cover so much material. Therefore, I use a lecture because that's the fastest and most efficient way to transmit all of this material, which makes sense. And the literature says lecture is super efficient at transmitting information. It's a great way to do it. There's also a tension between adequate positivism and critical ideas of the law. So the people who do a little bit, want to do more critical research or want to do more critical thinking in their class, feel like they have to do enough black letter law. This is adequate, what I call adequate positivism, and I'm using the words from somebody who said this. So there's a moment of pull towards a fear of inadequate positivism. I don't know what to say, like it's what's happening in the classroom isn't real enough or substantial enough or tangible enough to be examined. So there's a pull. Or here's what an exam should look like and what I have to do in the classroom to make sure it actually happened. So these people would switch back to lecture and more teaching focus or teacher focused practices in order to be adequately positivist or cover enough black letter law. And then the final factor, which is not, and I'm going to get into it, is the teaching context. So they talked to me about institutional factors and they talked to me about students, of why they felt disconnected. They don't think they're disconnected, that's my qualifying them. Institutional factor, course characteristics. Course characteristics, in the survey, these are the factors that people were influenced. So course type, and course type meant seminar or mandatory research course, was a factor that was listed by 82% of respondents. Course level, whether it's first year, second year, third year, by 65, 82, the students, the number of students. Obviously, the number of students has a huge impact on teaching practices, right? This confirms it, and it was also confirmed in the interviews. It's harder to do more interactive stuff when you have 100 people in front of you. Not impossible, but harder. And you see, the three, course level, course type, and number of students is also, they're all interconnected because people talk to me about large lecture classes, small seminars. So they go together. Internal directives or practices, some people mention those, well, there's an internal practice that we can't have 100% final, so obviously that has an impact on my evaluation methods. Physical space and setup of classrooms was also listed as and I actually saw it in some of the observations I did. I remember one time a woman wanted to write something on the board, a teacher wanted to write something on the board, and she had to climb over stuff. Like it was like, there was like debris and like things. Another time I saw someone, it was an overhead projector, and it was put this way. So basically her class was behind her, and she had to be like this. So she was talking to the wall, to the front, and the students were behind her. I mean, things like that. I actually saw that more in the observation. Time, huge factor, or the lack of it, right? I don't have time. And I have a couple of quotes that are 55.4% of the survey respondents listed time and resource constraints as a factor. And then I'm just going to let you, can you read that, or is it? The last one, I find it takes more time to more work to do interactive things rather than lecture. Surprisingly, it does. And I had no time to do anything other than figure out what was going on in the cases and present it to the students. Also, it's very true for as professors just starting out. We're just figuring out what the subject is all about. Sometimes we're teaching in an area that has nothing to do with our research. So that's a concern. There was a study in 2007 done by the Canadian Association of University Teachers that said that time is a number one stressor of Canadian academics. This isn't just in law, but just across the board. So we're not the only one feeling the crunch. Closely related to that is the tension between research and teaching, which many people talked about. The other thing that I'm just going to open a parenthesis, I actually asked extensive questions to law professors about their research, and then I asked them whether their research had an impact on their teaching, and most of the answers were no. It does for the content of the course, but I asked them if it influenced the way they taught, and they were like, had to think about it. And they're like, well, no, actually it's the opposite. My teaching influences my research. So anyways, but this is something else. This is the tension between having to do research and finding the time to do research and finding the time to spend on teaching. So time and resources, and then obviously what's valued in an institution. If teaching isn't valued, then why should you spend more time on it? I like this last quote. It's more the sense that, are you someone who counts in the institution? Are you a scholar? Are you a whatever? There was also a big difference in my field work between the teaching-oriented institution and the research-oriented institution. In the teaching-oriented institutions that I visited, people were around. They were in an office, it was open doors, it was easy for me to find participants. In the big research institutions I visited, no one was around. There were closed doors everywhere, and it was really hard for me to find participants. I hardly did any class observations in those. So I noticed a difference between the two, and the people talked to me about that. So the ones who were in the teaching focused or teaching-oriented institutions said they felt a lot of pressure to be good teachers, and they felt really supported in being a good teacher. The flip side to that was there was sort of an ethos of the score, the evaluation scores, and they were really concerned about that. And ironically, often that made them switch to lecture or more traditional approaches because of student evaluations. I'm going to come back to students because that's not the most important, but definitely a huge factor. So students, some of the ideas that came up when I talked to professors, and there also were other comments like students are really smart and all this stuff, but that wasn't a factor influencing their pedagogical choices. So many people talked about students being passive, about being unprepared for class, about being unmotivated. This is my disconnected group. Remember I said they were bitter and cynical and all that stuff? Students' lack of motivations. The students want the law thing. I heard that a lot in interviews. Students just want the law. They don't want me to have a discussion. They don't want to do any critical thinking. They just want the law. Student consumerism. This is a very common complaint in the literature, generally on higher education. Obsession with high grades. Institutional culture was mentioned by a few saying, we create them that way. The institutional culture influences students' attitudes towards their education. And then student evaluations were also a factor, although I wouldn't say it's a hugely important factor in pedagogical choices. At some point, we just stopped looking at them. You have a question? Yeah? Yeah, I didn't look at students at all in my study because already it was too huge, but I'm actually applying for a grant, which I'm hoping to get, looking at student learning approaches. And I'm going to come back. All of these factors that were mentioned when I looked at the literature on learning, all of these things can be explained by student learning approaches. So if students have a surface learning approach, there's two different kinds. There's a surface learning approach, and I'm not going to get into it too much because I talked about it yesterday, and then the deep learning approach. And some of these things, lack of motivation, can be explained by they're taking a surface learning approach, and the surface learning approach is influenced by the learning context. So the institution, the people who said we create them this way, they're actually quite right. The other thing, too, is that some of these comments can be explained by the whole literature on conceptions of knowledge. So, you start from dualistic thinking and you go all the way to relativist thinking. And students in first year usually have just give me the rules. Just give me the rules because I want the right answer. And if you just give it to me and I just, give it back to you, I will get a good grade. But that's a conception of knowledge. Yeah. Well, you have a dualistic view of legal knowledge. I would probably say you don't have that view of other knowledge, but of legal knowledge, right? And so if you go on and do graduate work and by your third year, you might actually say, oh, wait a second, there's no right answer in law. How many of us say there's no right answer in law? And the students are like, what's the right answer? There's no right answer in law. What's the right answer, right? And that's just because their conceptions of knowledge, we're like usually professors are way down the continuum, right? Anyway, so that's, yeah. But we forget about that, and so we're just frustrated all the time, right? True. True.
That's just what I mean by first year, because and I do have a good background in criminal law and criminal justice.
Because you don't have enough knowledge. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I disagree with that, but we could have a discussion about it for sure. Because I think you can do critical thinking in first year, but you do need a base, right? And I definitely think you can take a deep learning approach to first year material. But it's the learning context that's important, not just. But, however, having said that, if you have the pile like this of readings to do for every class, of course you're going to take a surface learning approach, right? Because you have no time to integrate it, right? So it's problematic. So, but I did a workshop yesterday on student learning approaches with professors. So, but we don't know this stuff. Law professors don't know about conceptions of knowledge, and law professors don't know about learning approaches of students. We know about learning styles and stuff, but learning approaches are highly influenced by their learning context, and we forget about it. So we actually have a say, and we can change things, because if we change the learning context, the student, I mean, not all, right? But if we encourage deep learning approaches, students will probably respond. I've done it in my own classes. I'm not saying I'm a perfect teacher, but I've done it in my own classes, and I have seen it. So, cut down on the coverage and do other different activities and stuff. But
because it would seem that they would retain it better if you're thinking about it and actually instead of just trying to memorize the rules, you would obtain the knowledge better because you're critically thinking about it.
But it's funny, but you say that, but I would say most of your professors don't want you to, or don't think that you should just memorize the rules, right? The learning context that they create make you feel that that's your perception, right? But that's not what their intentions are. I probably would guarantee most law professors don't think that, right? They don't think it's about memorizing the rules, not at all. But you end up adopting that approach because of the high level, high content, too much workload, and all these things. But yes, and it's not me, but the literature says if you take a deep learning approach, you will retain a lot more than if you take a surface approach. Not surprising. I remember writing my exams in law school, 100% finals, and seriously not remembering a single thing about that course 3 days later. Don't remember a single thing. I just over. And because I was studying for the exam madly, and then, it's over. So anyways, so I'm just going to wrap up. So these are the different factors that, again, that's another diagram. And then finally, I'm going to skip this. So what does this all have to do with learning? And here's my framework that I created for teaching and learning in Canadian legal education. So we have Can you read at the back? At the center, teaching practices, teaching methods, evaluation methods. The green arrows represent things, relationships that I looked at in my study. So I looked at the relationship between conceptions of teaching and teaching practices. I looked at the relationship between institution and institutional culture and teaching practices. I looked at the relationship between students, although not empirically, and teaching practices. And the impact of student learning approach on teaching practices, not the other way around. The black arrows are the relationships that are established in the literature. So, and then the dotted arrows are what I suspect are relationships that exist, but they haven't been established either by me or other studies. And then we have at the very end student learning outcomes. So what are students actually learning? So what does that mean? What's my conclusion? My conclusion is we have to put learning at the center of teaching in legal education. We have to pay attention to conceptions of teaching because they obviously have an impact on our teaching practices. And that's just a question of making people reflect about it. So reflection is key. And what I found in my study is most law professors that I talk to are quite reflective about their teaching, but the learning is not part of it. So when I ask questions about learning, they usually went, let me think about that. And they hadn't thought about it. The teaching part of it, they think about it a lot. How can I cover more material? No, I'm kidding. The students, obviously, students are important, and they're key, and they influence us as much as we influence them. Context, so paying attention to the teaching context and the learning context. Workload issues, huge, huge, huge. And finally, we have to value teaching. And my last comment is, we have to do more research on this. I can't be the only one. So I'm just going to end there. It's because it's already 1 o'clock, but I think there's no other class, so I'm happy to take questions. Unless, if you have to go, if you have a class, I'm okay. Yeah. Don't feel bad about getting up.
And yeah, I was just wondering if you could flip back to your big chart with the dotted lines and the...
Yep.
I'm just interested in your thoughts on the influence of the legal profession on both students and institutions. You haven't done the research, but just your thoughts.
The legal profession was not mentioned that often in my interview, surprisingly so. However, I did my study before all of this task force business came along. Even though historically there's always been a tension, I wouldn't say tension, but relationship, whether that's one that's tense or not, with the profession, historically speaking, in Canadian legal education generally. But the legal profession is sort of there in the background, right? They're there, and now with the task force, this becomes the legal. And I put an arrow towards students because most of our students want to enter the legal profession. In Quebec, it's a bit different, but most students never. And that's why that's why you go to law school, right? And so that has an impact on how they view their legal education, and I put it. Yeah, it has definitely an impact on the institution, and this will vary depending on the institution. So I think U of M, for instance, because it's the only law school in Manitoba, different situation in Ontario, where there's 5 or 6 different law schools in Ontario. And I think this also varies, maybe just from my gut feeling, between teaching-oriented institution and research-oriented institution. So that's why it's a dotted line. And with the task force, this is no longer a dotted line here because they're basically imposing curriculum. So, yeah, I'm not going to get into the task force. Yeah, Deloitte?
Can I ask you about conceptions of teaching?
Yeah.
And what's the source? What are the sources for this? Let me put the question a different way. Did you attempt to ask how do law teachers learn how to teach? Or put it another way, ought we try to teach law teachers how to teach, and if so, when and where? But this
Interesting question, and thank you. You remember my different conceptions? The people who were in the more learning-centered conception, or expressed ideas of the more learning-centered kind, strangely or not, all had some background and some training in pedagogy or education. And they, when they talk to me about learning, they talk to me about learning, first of all. The others talk to me about teaching. They talk to me about learning, and they put words, that, indicated to me that they knew what they were talking about. And so, yeah, I think it makes a difference, even though the survey results, and I don't have a slide for that, the survey results kind of say that it's not really an influence. So it is like a lot of law professors have taken some training, either by CULT or their professional centers in the university, but they don't seem to think that it's a factor, but my interview data seems to suggest otherwise. Because the people who have done it know what they're talking about.
But in the reflection element here, people are honest about this. They'll talk about all the models that they have in their own lives. I mean, I think back to, and so it's a very kind of regressive, reactionary accumulation of experiences, both good and bad. We all had bad teachers as undergrads and good teachers. I'm not sure then we knew what criteria we were making that judgment by. Or even in the present, for me, 40 years later, do I know what standards I'm still imposing on? So, do I want to be like? Okay. Now this is especially important for part-time faculty, for sessionals, for adjuncts.
Okay.
Who do they model themselves on? And that's why I think there's a huge gap here. And the second huge gap here is, what is the difference between this location for teaching law and the growing online internet, and how much of surface, your distinction between surface and deep, how much are we going to perpetuate, reinforce, and expand the impact and influence of this surface just with all the online teaching? So there are some. I mean, you're opening a real can of worms.
I know. About the first question, about your first point, actually, I did ask law professors when I interviewed them about, what do you think is a good teacher? What do you think is a bad teacher? And it's funny because the relationship to past teachers they had can be either positive or negative. So they can actually say, I'm doing the exact opposite of the best teachers I had. So I'm doing the opposite of the best teachers I have, but they can also say, I'm doing, the best teachers were like, and I want to be like them. And then, or I'm doing the opposite of the worst teachers that I had. So that's why it's hard to establish a relationship, because they were kind of all over the place about that. And about the online thing, I didn't even look at that. It's not really a huge factor in Canada so far, but I know it will be. And so I think that's an important thing too. There's all kinds of literature on online learning, and there are ways to foster deep learning approaches in online learning, but you have to do it right. And you have to have people who know what they're doing behind it. And if you just put text, it's the same, then or just, webcasts of people talking, there's like no interaction at all. So there's different ways of doing it. There's bad ways of doing it. But like I said, good pedagogy is good pedagogy. If you put it online, it'll be good. Bad pedagogy is bad pedagogy. If you put it online, it'll be bad. So, but thanks for the comments. Did the students in the room recognize themselves in there, or not at all? Yeah. Last year I taught after I did all this, my thesis, and I finished writing it. In my first class for my international environmental law class, I told students about student learning approaches, and they were like, whoa, they had no idea, right? They don't know about this. And then I made them sort of aware of that. And then I said, so all my evaluation methods will push you to take a deep learning approach. And I think it did. Maybe not for all of the students, but I think I pushed them to I made them do posters, and they had to do bricolage. They were like, oh, how come I have to do bricolage in a law course? They loved it. And any other questions? Yeah. Oh, Mike. You're going to get in shape, Ty.
Just wondering if any of the professors that you spoke with referenced tradition when they talked about why they teach the way they do. Like, I feel like with law school, there's this really sort of well-known conception of what it's going to be like the paper chase and all this stuff. And I know, like, my parents went to law school, and it sounds like the classes they took were, in a lot of ways, really similar to the ones that I take.
Yeah.
And some of the professors are still the same, you know? So, I don't know, like, I don't know if that actually goes through the mind of professors, but I feel like there's a popular conception of law school being a certain way, and a lot of what you're talking about actually isn't really similar to what it's supposed to be like when you hear about it.
Yeah, that's funny. There was a lot of reference to, I'm not sure it was tradition per se, but there was a lot of reference to this perception of a norm. And the norm is 100% final and lecture. That's the norm. And if I deviate from the norm, I'm going to pay for it. Student evaluation is going to be bad. My colleagues are going to say I'm not doing a good job, la, 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 and all this stuff. So that's a factor, the sort of perception that there is a norm. And I can only talk about the perception because I'm actually, I haven't looked at, is there a norm, is there not a norm? But it's their perception that there is a norm, and if they deviate from it, it's a bad thing. So that for sure, and especially the disconnected group. The people with the learning-centered conceptions who had the learning-focused practices knew about this norm, but somehow didn't seem to care. Or didn't care enough that they would change their ways. But the disconnected group, a lot of them talked about this perceived tradition or perceived norm. Yeah, for sure. And that perpetuates the same model, right? Because if you think it's going to be bad if you deviate from the norm. And some people got bad evaluations, and they told me about it because they deviated from the norm. So that's never happened to me personally, but yeah. You have a question, Michelle, or you're closing up? Closing up. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah. It's my pleasure, to thank Professor Rochette for coming all this way and for sharing all of this knowledge with us today. I'm particularly thankful also to see so many students, because actually, as you know, teaching is about you. So it's great to see you here today. And if you have, welcome anyone who's wants to continue the discussion. We're having a lunch upstairs in the faculty lounge, so it would be great if any of you or all of you come up and keep the conversation going. And on that note, I would like to thank, I'm very grateful that Professor Rochette came here all the way from Montreal. It's a pleasure to have you here and to share all this knowledge with you. And merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous.